I'm going to do this again. It doesn't say that it's recording to the cloud. It did say it'll be converted to an MP4. So
if we all hit record, we'll all try to record it locally and we'll all see what happens.
Yeah. Anyway, it's going. So
all right.
We got another 4 minutes or so as people start populating in. So
are you all doing any face-to-face this semester or online, or like where are you at with
we're probably
COVID?
90% online. We have some labs and some things that some of
Similar.
the things in fine art.
Yeah,
The
dance studio, that sort of thing. Yeah.
They just made a decision that fall semester will be back to on campus.
Same with us, although not for courses over 50 in enrollment because we don't have the classroom space, which tells me they're still thinking there'll be some distanced elements to the way it's set up. But that's a very small proportion of our classes. I don't teach anything larger than 25, and none of our graduate work. And so we'll mostly be back face to face. We have a group of students that was brought back for a living residential experience right around spring break for the second half of the semester, particularly the first year students. They wanted to give, I have no idea how I haven't been to campus in a year. I have no idea how it's playing out.
Yeah.
But yeah.
We decided that they're rolling the dice, and even our 300 person lectures will be in person in the fall.
Yeah.
So, it's our state governor just opened up the vaccine to anybody 16 or over starting April 12th.
Texas did that a couple days ago.
Yep. So, we're guardedly optimistic.
Yeah.
We all know that the current structure just doesn't work.
I got a text message last night from the state saying that I was, would I be interested in scheduling an appointment for vaccination at this time? And I replied, yes. And I immediately got a text message back that said, we are sorry, there are no vaccination appointments available at this time. We will contact you again soon.
Oh.
And so it seems that I need to be sitting with my phone. If I stop speaking in the next 45 minutes, the only reason short of calamitous health issue is that I got a text saying I can schedule a vaccination appointment.
Yeah.
That was true for us 2 weeks ago. And I think in McLean County, which is where ISU is, it was true even more recently than that. My county, I live 2 counties over, and I don't know, we got more supply, I guess, right? And still Chicagoland they're their own supply.
Sure.
So they're not the rest of the state. So they're like, we have people in 1B who haven't even gotten this yet. And you guys are on, the whole place is open. What's going on, right? And I'm like, man, we got 90% of all people over age 65 are vaccinated, and we're at a third of the adults. I mean, so, I guess the one time Chicago having their own supply didn't work out for them because it's a density thing, right? They don't have the capacity, right? We open up the state fairgrounds and it's like, let's go, well-oiled machine.
It's the same here. I live in Baltimore, and the state has set up 5 remote, five mass vaccination sites. One of them is literally 2 blocks from my house. It's the Baltimore Ravens football stadium because I live right downtown. And the one that's closest to down south in Maryland they've just found out, is actually in the Baltimore Sun this morning, more than half the people that have been vaccinated there are actually not residents of the state of Maryland. They're coming over from Virginia and so there's a lot of controversies about just equity and distribution and administrative competence and so on that state's really struggling with right now. So we'll see how that plays.
Yeah. Well, I've got 3 o'clock, so I think I'll go ahead and get started. I welcome everyone and thank you for joining us for our final speaker in the water lecture series that we've had throughout the academic year. My name is Joan Brame. I teach in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at ISU. And together with Professor Noha Shahi, who's professor in the Department of Politics and Government, we co-direct the Center for Sustainable Water Future, which is hosting this speaker series. And the speaker series is funded by the Office of the Associate Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies, led by Craig McLaughlin, who's joining us here as well today. And thank you, Craig, and the office for the funds to help do this. Obviously, we had planned to do this in person, but we're doing our best with Zoom, and that's actually working out quite well. So I also want to quickly acknowledge and thank the members of the advisory board for the Center for Sustainable Water Future, Dave Kopsel, Department of Agriculture, Eric Peterson, Department of Geography, Geology, and Environment, Elizabeth Reed, the Director of Sustainability, Clay Robinson, Department of Agriculture, Nathania Rubin, School of Art, and Elsie Yang, Department of Health Sciences. We're thrilled to have Dr. Ken Conca here with us today from American University. Dr. Conca's research and teaching focus on global environmental governance, environmental peace building in war-torn societies, environmental politics and policy in the United Nations system, water governance, and environmental policy analysis. His most recent books are the Oxford Handbook of Water Politics and Policy and An Unfinished Foundation, the United Nations and Global Environmental Governance. He's the editor of the widely used teaching anthology Green Planet Blues. Conca's research has been recognized with several prestigious awards, including the Graumeyer Prize for Ideas in Improving World Order, the International Studies Association's Harold and Margaret Sprout Award for the Best Book on International Environmental Affairs, and the Chadwick Alger Prize for the Best Book in the Field of International Organization. So we're thrilled to have Dr. Conca with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to him to engage us with his talk, Water, Climate Change, and the Risk of Violent Conflict.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Joan. It's really exciting to be here today. And thanks to Joan and Noha for inviting me. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, but maybe we'll find a way to rectify that at some point in the not too distant future. And as you said, I think we all have a little bit of experience with Zoom lectures. We know it can be deadly boring and tedious, and I'm going to try to keep it fresh and lively. And I think I got some good images that'll help us do that as we go. So what I'd like to do today with this talk is a few things. First, just say a bit about what I think we know about water and climate change. That may be somewhat of a review for some folks. Second, I want to say what it is I think we know about water and conflict, about climate change and conflict, and about the cocktail of water, climate change, and conflict. Third, I want to look at a few specific focal points for that discussion, because it doesn't happen in the abstract. It happens in real places in the landscape. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about internationally shared river basins, which obviously create challenging upstream, downstream relationships between different countries. I'm going to talk a little bit about civil conflict and civil war, including the dynamics in Syria, which some people have said is one of the first climate conflicts. And other people have thoroughly rejected that framing of what's happening in Syria. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then third, I'm going to talk about some of the dynamics on a more localized scale of specific catchments and watersheds and so on, which is where most of the violence around water in the world is actually ongoing. And it's important to note that. So with that as a bit of a frame, water's the delivery mechanism for climate change. People will not experience climate change by walking outside on a Tuesday afternoon and saying, my goodness, it's 3 to 4 degrees Celsius warmer than it should be, and the world is not the same. Well, the world will not be the same when it's 3 to 4 degrees warmer, but most people's lived experience of climate change is going to be through changes in the water cycle. Runoff, precipitation, evaporation, soil moisture, extreme episodes of drought and flooding. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change when it published its 5th assessment report. It's a little dated now. We're all waiting for the 6th assessment to see what it's going to say. But the 5th assessment, which came out in 2014, 2015, really flagged these 5 effects that I have on the screen. I'm not going to talk through them in general. And it's the consequences of these effects that create the lived experience of what climate change will mean for most people, indirectly and often quite directly. And if there's conflict risk here, it's these effects that are creating it. Much of this is based on modeling and on averaging of models and on running of different scenarios. And if you're old like me, you remember the old Trident gum commercial. I always wondered what that 5th dentist was recommending instead. They never put that into the commercial. But sometimes when you look at the process by which an entity like IPCC makes its judgments, it dials up our emphasis not on the certainties, but on the uncertainties. And that's appropriate. And uncertainty is going to be one of the big messages in my talk today. There's a lot that's going on with water that enhances uncertainty in ways that can be quite risky for conflict. Nonetheless, it's not all uncertainty, and it's not all based on computer modeling. This is long-term estimation of rainfall in the Sahel, the dry subtropical band that spans across Africa in between the more sort of lush forested regions of Africa and the Sahara Desert to the north. And there's a clear long-term secular trend of declining rainfall over a century. And this is measured or estimated from measurements. This is the intake of water in the Perth city water supply system in Australia for the 20th century. And we see a lot of interannual variation, but we also see a clear stepwise decline in the availability of water across these 3 time periods that are defined in this figure. These are estimates of the loss of mass snow and ice in the glaciers and ice caps. And we see most places around the world over the last 5 decades, we've seen a pretty substantial decline in the formation and maintenance of snow and ice. And this is an attempt to estimate over a 50-year period the increasing intensity. This is basically the number of unusually wet days. Climate models suggest that some places will get wetter and some places will get drier. And a very broad rule of thumb is the wet will get wetter and the dry will get drier, although that's not always a reliable slogan. But however much rain falls, the models suggest, and we have some empirical evidence to suggest, it's going to fall in more concentrated and intensified episodes because of the acceleration of the water cycle. And this data suggests that. And so that leads IPCC to conclude that freshwater related risks of climate change increase significantly. And they feel there's high agreement and robust evidence for that. And I agree entirely. We're waiting on the 6th assessment, and it will be interesting to see how several years of research update that conclusion. I don't think it's going to get more sanguine. That has led to many different kinds of reactions about climate change, water, and social consequences. And one of them is a narrative about the coming climate wars. I picked these 4 books only because they're the 4 most prominent ones that use the phrase climate wars in the title. Jump to the conclusion. I do think there's conflict risk here, and I think it's a very important question for us to consider. I also don't think that some of the climate wars narrative is the most helpful way to think about the conflict risk that is actually greatest here. And I'll try to persuade you of that in the coming minutes. But nonetheless, this has become a meme, essentially. Ban Ki-moon, prior Secretary General of the UN, and not someone given to bold and extreme statements, in many ways as a Secretary General, playing a fairly quiet and cautious and bureaucratic role, coming in the wake of Kofi Annan, who was quite the antithesis of that in some ways, putting together this what he calls actually an unholy brew that can create dangerous security vacuums. Climate change isn't only real, it's accelerating in a dangerous manner. Many more threats just over the horizon. Mega crises may well become the new normal. You may know there was a meeting of the UN Security Council on climate change as a risk to international peace and security just a couple of weeks ago. John Kerry, representing the United States as Joe Biden's special climate envoy. The meeting was chaired by the United Kingdom, and Boris Johnson, the prime minister, came over to actually sit in the chair as a way of signaling the importance that the United Kingdom attaches to this question. Do a Google search on the phrase water wars, and this is what turns up. I did a Google image search and I grabbed this. Now, there's a video game on water wars. There's a lot going on in these images, but you can start to see some of the real tropes, the cracked earth of the drought and the phrase water wars itself, and dangerous looking maps with troubled regions of the world colored in red. And so on. And I think a lot of this narrative, some of which is coming from people who know a lot about water or a lot about climate change, but maybe not a lot about violent conflict, or people who know a lot about violent conflict, but maybe not a lot about water and climate change. I think the conventional wisdom that threads through this is the idea that scarcity creates grievances and grievances trigger violence, or at least are a risk factor for subsequent violence. That's true as far as it goes. Scarcity can create grievances. It can also create innovation. And grievances can trigger violence. They can also trigger innovative solutions. And sometimes people suffer violence with clenched teeth because they don't have the capacity to mobilize and act upon their grievances. So while it may well be the case that climate change will induce water scarcity, although it does a lot of other things as well, and it may be the case that that scarcity drives an acceleration of true grievances, denial of water, loss of rights, and that those grievances take us further to being enacted violently in some manner. That's only one pathway through a very complicated landscape, and it's not necessarily the pathway that creates some of the significant violence risks that I think we face. So I want to unpack that story a little bit and challenge sort of the water wars and climate wars narrative, but not in a way that dismisses the very real risks of violence. It's even entered the popular culture. Some of you may be familiar with this interesting sci-fi novel, The Water Knife. I confess I couldn't get through it, but you might enjoy it. It's about a dystopian near future southwestern United States in which both water-rich and water-poor states have heavily militarized borders. The water-rich states to keep desperate people out, and the water-poor states to keep desperate people in. And it rings true in a certain way if you've traveled in the southwestern United States in the summer, or if you see the way people focus on the Colorado as a basin at risk. I'll say more about that in a moment. And certainly there's some truth to this story. This is the government of the Maldives, a very low-lying island nation, essentially an atoll, a string of atoll islands, holding a cabinet meeting underwater several years ago to dramatize the effect that for them, climate change is an existential threat to national security, because they'll be underwater at some point and the islands will become inhabitable long before they're fully underwater in that sense. And if we extend that conversation, not just to the couple of million people that live in Pacific Ocean island atolls, if we extend it to larger islands, if we extend it to floodplain area, low-lying floodplain areas in coastal zones, we're now talking about tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of people who are exposed and are at risk, as this figure demonstrates in the case of Bangladesh. So the issues are quite real. This map takes some of the world regions that are most prone to violent conflict, above a certain threshold, which in this figure happens to be defined as 25 or more battle deaths among the combatants in the conflict in a given year. It might be civil war, it might be violence between drug cartels. I mean, there's different forms of violence, but nonetheless rises above a certain threshold. That's all the yellow and red and tan dots. And under it is something called the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which I won't unpack right here and now, but it's basically a measure of dryness. And there's a clear visual association between the areas that are concentrated with dots and that are pink on the Palmer Drought Severity Index. Now, correlation is not causation. Just because those two things are happening in the same place doesn't mean that A is causing B or B is causing A. They might both be a product of other circumstances, but it makes you think. So, given that, we hear the water wars narrative, we hear the climate wars narrative. Now, there has been a pushback on this by skeptics, and I've got a screenshot here of one of the first pushbacks that was published over a decade ago now by Aydin Salihan, who's one of the leading scholars of civil conflict. And he said, not so fast. There's good reason to think maybe that's not the road that it will go down. And I'm not going to go through the 5 bullets that are on the screen in any detail, except to say that on the one hand, I agree with everything that's on the screen. I believe that those are all to be true statements. On the other hand, I don't find them all as comforting as perhaps Aydin Salihan does. Obviously, much depends on how governments respond. If climate change is the big dependent variable driving the system, and conflict is the dependent variable, the outcome of concern, obviously there are things in the middle that matter, intervening variables, right? And obviously government and governance is going to be one of those intervening variables. But governments often respond in ways that worsen the problem. And I'm going to have a few clear examples of that, I think, in the narrative that follows. And so it's not necessarily comforting to say, from a conflict and peace point of view, that much depends on how governments respond. It's also true that war is an inefficient and costly way to resolve conflicts. I'll talk a little bit about the Nile in a moment. And as some of us may know, there's a lot of tension between Ethiopia and Egypt around the Nile because Ethiopia is building a dam in the headwaters and Egypt is very worried about the flow. Egypt stores 2 years of water behind its own mega dam, and it's very worried about the flow downstream if all that water is being trapped upstream by Ethiopia. Well, it's true that Egypt could fly its air force up into the headwaters of the Nile and blow up the dam and fly back. Except it's not true that it could do both. They haven't, what I am told is, I have no intelligence clearance or any of that, but what I'm told is they have Air Force has the capacity to carry enough munitions to destroy the dam, and it has the capacity to carry enough fuel to fly there and back, doesn't have the capacity to do both. And so it makes you stop and think, is Egypt likely to sacrifice a large chunk of its air force to destroy that dam? Well, certainly that's possible, but it's also possible that they're going to work really, really hard for other ways to address their water grievances with Ethiopia. So it is true that war is an inefficient and costly means of dispute resolution, but wars do occur. And sometimes they're not rationally chosen phenomena. So in that sense, it's true, but it doesn't necessarily resolve the debate in the favor of people who say climate wars is not really a thing. More recent, I just cite this as an article that came out more recently. It's a very good recent literature review, not written by me. I'll be making these slides available and the citations that go with them available to organizers if anybody wants to follow up on that, or you can just email me my email address. I'll put it back on the screen at the end, my email address. Provides very, very good. And it's interesting to note the 2 punchlines in the abstract. The literature has not yet detected a robust and general effect linking climate to conflict. However, there is some substantial agreement that climate change contributes to conflict under some conditions and through certain pathways. So it's a nuanced statement, right? It's basically the classic statement that the social sciences makes in the face of complexity. Well, it depends. And we're starting to learn what it is that it depends upon, right? And I think that's actually a reasonable way to describe it. Just as a bit of an aside, why would it be that some of the statistical studies trying to find a robust association between climate change as a driver and violence as an outcome, or water change as a driver and violence as an outcome, or the complicated cocktail of climate through water driving violence as an outcome, is not finding a robust association? It may be that the association is not there, certainly, the null hypothesis. It may also be that is most of these studies specify water change or climate change or conflict in very different ways. Climate change is sometimes measured, it's really short-term weather change, but even then, is it soil moisture? Is it temperature change? Is it water resources availability? Is it protracted drought? Is it the Palmer Drought Severity Index? And so all of these studies are not really in conversation with each other because of the way that they're specifying some of the variables that they use. The same is true with conflict. There's more than one measure of conflict. What forms of violence are we talking about? Just war? Just state-based violence? Just crime and other forms of, there's different ways of specifying it. So it may just be noise in the studies, and they are finding common results, but they can't see it because of the way they specify the variables. Some things are hard to specify as a variable. How do you quantify grievances? It's not impossible, but different scholars do it in different ways. It's certainly not easy. Sometimes the data is overly aggregated. It's not spatially referenced, and we're using national averages or annual averages. What we really want to know is in this part of the country during the rainy season. And so both spatially and temporally, the data isn't as disaggregated as we like. We're making a lot of progress with that, but sometimes you have really good spatial data on water and monthly data, and you can see the wet season and the dry season in different parts of the country, really valuable. But then you have to re-aggregate that data because the social data we want to lay down on top of it is not adequately spatially referenced. So it's challenging. A lot of progress, and this will come with time, but it may be why we don't see it. Another more troubling reason why we may not see it is because we're not looking in all the right places. I won't get into the weeds of the details here, and I realize this is very, very small on the screen, but what this slide shows is that there is more scholarly research on climate change on the continent of Africa that focuses on South Africa and Kenya than all the other countries on the continent combined. And there's a good reason for that. They both have modern international airports. They both are former British colonies where English is widely spoken. They both have large governmental and intergovernmental and non-governmental communities in large modern cities that are working on these issues. And for a scholar who wants to get research funding and go execute their research, it's easier. And maybe that's fine if you're trying to prove the existence of a certain concept. But at some point, you know, it may be very different in French-speaking Africa because of the differences between British colonial law and French colonial law and the forms of state-based governance that we see evolving in those post-colonial societies. It may be very different in very small places. It may be very different in the interior of the continent. And so they called this the spotlight effect because it's sort of like the drunk who's looking for his lost car keys under the streetlight, and someone walks up and asks what he's doing or she's doing, and they say, I lost my car keys. I'm looking for my car keys. Where'd you lose them? 2 blocks over. Why are you looking here? Because the light's better. But that's obviously problematic if you want to find your car keys or if you want to find this sort of an effect. And we're only just discovering through some really smart research like this in the last couple of years that that sort of a streetlight effect is omnipresent, not just in climate conflict studies, which are drawn to conflicted places, but in more general social science research about climate change effects, something that needs to be corrected. I'll skip over some, and it may just be complexity. I know you can't see the lettering in this. Just look at it as though it's a picture hanging on the wall. It's a flow model from left to right of how to think about causality in climate-driven conflict. Starts with adverse climate effects on the left, moves to some physical manifestations, moves to some social responses, brings in some of those intervening variables. It says things like bad governance, social inequality, bad neighbors, things we also know shape conflict, some more social effects of that whole mix. And it ends in a situation where there may well be an enhanced desire to use violence to settle grievances and an enhanced ability to use violence to settle grievances, both of which are necessary for violence to actually occur. And in the fine print at the bottom, it says, note that all of the feedback loops are left out of the model. It's already a very complex model. So it may be that the state of the art of statistical inference just can't tease robust causality out of a system of this complexity. The other thing we have to keep in mind is there's a lot going on with water in the world today. This is sort of the equivalent of IPCC. It's the UN Environment Programme's periodic global environmental outlook report, GEO6 2019, I think. It's pretty recent. I really recommend taking a look at this if you want to get a perspective on issues you're not that familiar with from 30,000 feet. It's really rich with data. It's rich with hopeful stories as well as sobering ones. When you look at what it points out that we know to be happening around water, we're using more water globally. The supply is not fixed because some of it is in very remote areas. Some of it is groundwater that hasn't been tapped. And so in theory, there are potentials for supply expansion, but they start running into limits at some point, either of cost or of controversy or of technical feasibility. We're already using about half of the available runoff planet-wide for human purposes. And so we shouldn't be sanguine about supply expanding, although in certain places and in certain ways, desalinization and so on and so forth, that's very important, obviously. There's an enormous water health linkage. It's estimated that 15 to 20% of the global disease burden could be eliminated if everyone had safe drinking water and rudimentary adequate sanitation. But there's a couple of billion people on the planet that don't. And the onslaught on freshwater ecosystems that are critical to human well-being, biodiversity, fishing, flood protection, just a range of services that we reap from swamps, bogs, wetlands, peat bogs, etc. The draining, damming, diverting, and dumping that we have subjected them to has really imperiled them before we even start talking about climate change. So all of this means that if there's a linkage between water and conflict, it may well be driven by these dynamics, and climate change sort of has to get in line or fit into that model in some way. And again, climate change, water scarcity, grievance, violence doesn't account for some of these dynamics. What do we know about water and violent conflict? I'm not going to organize my lecture around these themes. You'll see them threaded through what I'm about to say, but basically, there's a lot of cooperation around water. In some, by most measures, it dwarfs the amount of violence that there is around water. Scarcity is often, it's a thing, and it's a thing for conflict. So I'm not in any way dismissing it, but it's often not the primary driver. There's something else going on. It's about rights. It's about access. It's about a socially manufactured form of scarcity rather than an absolute physical aspect of scarcity. Abundance of water can be a risk factor for certain forms of conflict. Just as an abundance of oil, an abundance of hardwood timber, and abundance of diamonds has been shown to be a significant risk factor for civil war. And despite all of that saying, forget this simple water wars narrative or climate wars narrative, there is a great deal of violence around water. Most of it's localized. Most of it doesn't scale up to the level of civil war or interstate war. But that doesn't mean it's not deeply, deeply concerning. And most of it relates to questions not of absolute physical water scarcity, but of the political economy, of access, of rights, and of the displacement of people, particularly for contentious water infrastructure or for water grabs. So to illustrate some of that, because it doesn't happen in the abstract, it happens in real places in the landscape, I'm going to say a bit about international river basins, I'm going to say a bit about civil war, and I'm going to say a bit about localized conflict. And I'm absolutely going to stop at 15 minutes before the hour to allow for Q&A. And I'll say a bit about where, given all of this, where a few broad lines of where we need to be going. There are over 300 rivers in the world that either form a border or cross a border, or in many cases do both. That number changes over time, mostly not because the river's path changes, but because the underlying borders change. We tend to think of borders as fixed, but the implosion of the Soviet Union gave us many new rivers that now cross an international border rather than being ruled centrally from Moscow. The implosion of Yugoslavia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, there's many, many examples. The world's borders are a much more brittle and dynamic and changing and reconstructed or transformed thing than we generally take them to be. Many of those international river basins are subjected to significant amounts of water stress. This is a very crude indicator. It's just so many cubic meters per person per year flowing through the river. It says nothing about water use. It says nothing about demand. It says nothing about alternative supply for groundwater. It says nothing about culture. And so it's not a good early warning indicator of conflict risk, except in the crudest sense. But again, it makes you think. The most systematic study of conflict and cooperation dynamics in the world's river basins was done in the geography department at Oregon State University about 10 years. It's still ongoing in some ways, but the big landing of the data analysis is about 10 years ago. They collected data on conflict and cooperation episodes in as many river basins as they could analyze over more than a 50-year period. They were trying to build an early warning model that said, these three conditions in the basin, low incomes, water scarcity, and non-democratic regimes, let's say, for example, they are associated in a statistically significant way with conflict outcomes in that basin. And so we can look at a basin and say, there might be problems here. They failed to do that in an interesting way because you can't build that sort of a structural model. All the variables they tried to correlate, they couldn't correlate them with conflict around water. Water scarcity is not a good predictor of tensions in the basin. Low incomes is not a good predictor of tensions in the basin. Authoritarian regimes or democratic regimes or any kind of regime is not a good predictor of scarcity. What they found instead was two things. First, it was more of a stress response model. The basin comes under stress, institutions try to adapt. If they're effective and they've got enough time, they adapt, and maybe there's no risk of violence. Conflict is resolved in some manner. But if the institutional base is not effective, or if they're overwhelmed by the rapidity of change, then you have a problem. And that correlates with episodes of conflict in the basin. And that makes intuitive sense once you think about it. The other thing they found is that cooperative events outnumbered conflictive events by more than 2 to 1. There was lots of treaty signing during this 50-year period, and that most of the conflictive events were limited to rhetorical exchanges. Now, that could be really difficult, problematic. I don't mean to minimize rhetorical conflict. It could get in the way of various forms of cooperation and climate adaptation and water management that need to happen in the basin. But it's short of war. They found 37 instances that rose to the level of military or otherwise violent confrontation, but none of them that rose to the level that they were willing to call a war. So given all of that, what I think it really does is it calls our attention to the need for cooperative institution building in these basins, including cooperative institution building for dispute resolution. And when we look at the international law, the treaties essentially that are being created in the world's river basins, we see a sort of a good news, bad news pattern. On the one hand, many basins have got treaties in place, and that's important because they create the institutions, the exchange of science, the dispute resolution mechanism, all the other sorts of things, the joint projects, the joint environmental management, the releases of water from storage in a coordinated manner based on dialogue, not just unilateral, right? So the treaties are really important in that manner. The UN has negotiated a global convention that's a sort of a framework, model legislation, you could think of it as, for how treaties in basins might want to be written. And it contains some really, really important principles. Avoid significant harm to all states in the basin, share the water equitably, coordinate on the environment, exchange information deeply, routinely, and regularly, notify in advance if you are planning a project, give the institution time to adapt so it doesn't get overwhelmed by the rapidity of change, resolve disputes peacefully, and create the machinery now for the disputes that we know are coming. And we actually see that happening in many basins in the world. I did a study some years back of how those principles were diffusing basin by basin around the world. And the most rapid principle diffusion that we saw was the dispute resolution principle. And that was encouraging. Countries see conflicts coming and they're arming themselves with some apparatus to forestall it in some sense. But there's an awful lot of bad news here as well. And one of my take-home messages is really the need to firm up the institutional arrangements and modernize the ones that already exist. Many of the agreements are patchwork, right? In the Mekong, it's only the downstream states that have joined the treaty regime. China and Myanmar, up in the headwaters, building dams, have not joined the regime. And this is a common pattern. In the Nile, as I'll say in a moment, there's something similar going on. And many of these provisions, they're more like a 19th century pair of handcuffs that the governments agree to put on that says, you get this much water, we get this much water. Here's what we'll do in a dry year. If we can't agree, we'll talk about it for 6 months. And if we still can't agree, we'll take it to the World Court, which will probably take 15 years to render a judgment if it agrees to hear the case. So it's not the kind of modern, rapid, adaptive, integrated, climate smart governance that we need to see. And it does not contain the participatory mechanisms to bring a wider set of stakeholders to the table. So modernizing the law of river basins is, I think, one thing that's pretty essential. There's a fascinating story on the Nile. Somebody asked me about the Nile in the Q&A if you want to hear that story, but I think it really illustrates, countries are finding a way to dialogue. The glass is half full. And I actually don't think the risk between Egypt and Ethiopia is quite as great as many people have made it out to be. It's there, very serious, but I do think there's a path forward toward agreement on that, partly because I think Ethiopia is just creating facts on the ground that Egypt is going to have to accept. So with some good mediation, I think that can be broached. But the glass is also half empty, because getting that agreement in place for all the states in the basin, we haven't found the formula for that yet, and making it a 21st century climate adaptation instrument rather than a 19th century, here's how we share the water instrument, very challenging, and has really only starting to catch the attention of very powerful decision makers in the basin. On civil war, I'm just going to talk about the Syrian example because it's been so frequently held up. The region was hit with a crippling drought, and there's no question in my mind that drought is part of the story of civil war in Syria. I have looked at this carefully. I don't do research on the ground in Syria. No one's doing research on the ground today in Syria, but the Middle East is not really, I've done some work in Palestine. Syria is not really my expertise, but it's important to understand the case, and I've tried really hard to understand the case. There's no question Syria was hit with a crippling drought. There's also no question that Turkey, the Caspian, Egypt, Iran were also hit with crippling drought, and we didn't see the same pattern of events there that we saw in Syria. There's obviously other contributors to the outcome. There's no question in my mind that drought played into existing grievances, particularly in the north of the country, particularly among farmers, particularly among smallholders among farmers, that inflamed things, that mobilized those grievances, that led to some of the mass protests that then ran downhill into violence and civil war. But you can't understand that dynamic without adding to the mix decades of bad water management, totally focused on the supply side, not focused on the demand side, using water as a political tool to rebuild the regime's support with large landowners through the way that irrigation practice is conducted and water is dispensed and so on, and inappropriate state responses. This Syria is going through a period of neoliberal economic reform that was stripping away subsidies and the safety net for small farmers just when they got hit by a crippling drought. And there's no question in my mind that those factors are very much more the water story in Syria than the triggering episode of the drought. The drought might have been the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, but the ground was very, very well prepared for that by some other dynamics underwater. Now, some people look at that and they say, don't call Syria a climate change conflict because you're absolving the regime of its responsibility and its agency and its decades of repression and bad water management. And other people say, do call it a climate change conflict, because we need to know that under those conditions, drought can trigger this sort of horrific, calamitous episode that we have seen. I understand that debate, and I have my own views about that debate. But what I'm more interested in is a question of what would it have looked like to have an early warning system in place? You hear a lot around the UN Security Council talk about we need a climate change early warning system so we can sort of see the dangers coming and act in an anticipatory manner, in a peace building manner, in a supporting manner, in an adaptive manner, and avoid violence in that manner. I don't disagree with any of that, but it's sobering to think what it would have required to see the drought trigger coming 2 years in advance in Syria. You'd have to have intimate knowledge of Syria's water management practices. You'd have to have intimate knowledge of farm subsidies and the regime's neoliberal economic reforms. You'd have to have intimate knowledges of the politics of governance in Syria, in addition to all the hydrologic, climate, et cetera, data that you'd need to see this coming. And so when you hear about early warning systems, there are people who have that knowledge. It sits in very fragmented places, and there's no way to sort of operationalize it effectively in real time for decision makers. And so this too is a project, and it's a somewhat daunting and a somewhat sobering one. I did a briefing with some ambassadors at the UN on climate change and conflict a couple of years ago, and there was great interest in headed down this road as an obvious way to try to forestall conflict. It's not an easy task to pull off, this kind of early warning. In the interest of time, I'm not going to say too much about the flip side of scarcity is water abundance, except to say we know what causes civil war. It's basically the factors on the screen. Now, there are always places where you might predict it. Nigeria is what they call a false positive. It has many of these conditions. It hasn't descended into civil war. There's other forms of violence on the ground in Nigeria. There are other places where you'd look at them through this lens and you'd say, why hasn't there been a civil war already 20 years ago? So, you know, life is complex, but nonetheless, we have a good early warning model for civil war. When you add natural resources to that, you see two surprising things. Scarcities like deforestation, soil erosion, water scarcity, they don't add predictive power to this model. They don't turn up as statistically significant. However, when you look at certain kinds of natural resources, abundance starts to come up as a risk factor. Petroleum, hardwood timber, diamond. We know that there's a sort of a robust correlation between civil conflict and the presence in abundance of those resources. Sometimes it's because the resources themselves are what triggers the conflict. Sometimes it's because it generates flows of funding to sustain conflict. We don't know a lot about what's going on with this. And I've included a slide here that I'm not going to talk about why that might be the case. Is it because it breeds a certain brittle form of governance? Is it because it incites subnational disputes? Is it because of corruption? It may be all of these things. But when you stop and think about water, I think there's actually a non-trivial risk that water, not the water itself, but the infrastructure of water, the big irrigation schemes, the big agricultural colonization schemes, the large dams create exactly that sort of abundance conflict risk. There's no question that they're associated with corruption. You look at the corruption scandal that Brazil is embedded in today, and it is absolutely triggered in bribery around large construction projects by one firm in particular that is implicated in dam building in the Amazon. You look at a country like Laos in the middle of the Mekong midstream, right, below China and Myanmar, but upstream of the Delta countries, a very, very poor country with a very brittle authoritarian regime that stays in power mostly through repressive force and delivering incomes, except that it really struggles to deliver incomes because Laos doesn't have much that it can export, and it's not fertile, it doesn't attract international investment. So they build enormous dams and they sell most of the power to Thailand. What happens to Laos if the world economy gets taken down 10 years from now for the third time in 20 years, which is what it would be now, and there's an economic crash in Thailand? And suddenly Laos can't export the power. And the debt that Laos has gone into to build the dams and the ambitious development schemes that the government is selling to the people as a way to stay in power don't come to fruition. So we need to think about how water abundance and the way that governments react to that can create a whole other pathway to brittleness, fragility, contention, and possibly violent conflict. I'm going to stop because it's 4:45, with the exception of one slide, sort of the punchline at the end. I'm not going to talk too much about localized conflicts. There's some really interesting stories around farmer-herder dynamics, and many people see that as conflict risk, but there's some really intriguing cooperative initiatives also emerging in that space that we could talk about. Again, if people want to ask me about that in the Q&A, I could say a word or two about it. I'll just give you some teasers about Lake Chad and such there. Paths forward for me, given my current understanding of this cocktail of climate change, water dynamics, and violent risk. Absolutely essential that we start thinking in international river basins about what do climate smart dispute resolving basin institutions actually look like. Because most of the institutions that we have built and continue to build, they don't have the flexibility, they don't have the adaptive capacity, they don't have the multiple layers of cross-border dialogue that are going to be required to be climate smart and adaptive. Second, there's a powerful argument for smaller scale flexible infrastructure. If you know exactly what the future holds, then it probably does make sense to build 1,000 megawatt dam, one huge pile of concrete in one place. Now, it's probably an ecological nightmare. It's probably a human rights nightmare. I don't support most of the large dams that are being built these days. The point is, that's not the only argument against them. Under conditions of rampant uncertainty, financial uncertainty, as well as climate change uncertainty. What's the price of water? What's the price of land? What's the price of food? What's the interest rate going to look like 50 years from now? Because that's the life cycle of that dam. There's a very strong, hard-headed economic argument for decentralization, for flexible infrastructure, for small scale, for wind and solar, for small is beautiful, before we even get to the argument about human rights, about small d democracy, about sustainability, about lightening the environmental impact or the climate footprint. Those two narratives have to find each other to make the full case for letting some air out of the conflict risk balloon by lightening the footprint of the water infrastructure that we build and making it more climate smart and more flexible and more adaptable. And then the third piece is tapping water's peace building potential. These are Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian mayors, one of the world's most conflicted zones, one of the most intractable conflicts, who jumped into the Jordan River together at the behest of an NGO called EcoPeace to try to facilitate cooperative dialogue in a very practical sense, saying, we live in a very dry land, we're sitting on top of the same aquifer, we share the Jordan, and we're mayors. We're like the ultimate in pragmatic political beasts. If we don't deliver the goods of water, of sanitation, what have you, we won't be mayors for long. And we can't afford this conflict. We have to find ways to transcend it, particularly at the local scale. There's enormous untapped potential around water cooperation as a strategic tool for transforming conflict identities, creating cooperative knowledge, starting to reduce mistrust and build trust in its place, and start to instill a habit of cooperation with a longer shadow of the future. And I think that's a path forward as well. I'll stop there. I apologize for going a couple of minutes long, and I know we want to do a little bit with the Q&A, but hopefully that'll be helpful. And as I said, I'll be happy to share the slides with people. And I think I'll just leave that slide, that somewhat hopeful slide on the screen as we're talking. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ken. That was wonderful. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to open it up to other people. So we're a small enough group, people can just unmute if you want, or you can throw something in the chat. I'm also monitoring that.
Thank you for clapping. Virtually, Craig, I appreciate it. I can almost hear you clapping.
Well, Ken, I guess I can start. I'm Dave Kopsel. I'm from the Department of Ag.
Hi,
And
Dave.
I have done global consultation before and worked with a lot of growers. And I guess one thing I want to kind of throw out there, maybe a theoretical question, is, when you talk about agriculture, we have, flood furrow irrigation, but we also have drip irrigation. In what you've seen and based on your expertise, is there a lot more potential out there for efficient use of water in a discipline like agriculture? Or are we kind of working with what we got and we just need more people to adopt drip irrigation?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's in some ways, it's the 64,000 or 64 trillion, whatever the value of the international food trade is in global food commerce, right? The short answer, just to let other questions come in, and then maybe we can chat later, I'd love to. My view is that there's enormous potential. Most of it doesn't reside in more technically efficient on-farm applications of water. That's not because the potential is not there. I mean, you put water right in the root zone, and as you know, you can get these sort of astronomical efficiency is a tricky thing to measure in that context. But as you know, you can get some really astronomical numbers compared to the kind of slow and plodding numbers that we get with these, the sprinklers or worse, flooding the fields or what have you. The tricky piece with that is to sort of create the rule framework around it, transforming irrigation systems that have these very sort of carefully worked out schemes for who gets water on Tuesday and how much do we pay to repair the, so particularly at the sort of the smaller scale where farmers and livelihoods really need that infusion of efficiency gains. It's really, really tricky. And so it's kind of the software side of it rather than the hardware side of it that makes it more challenging. And the other thing I think is that on farm, my reading, I'm certainly not, an agronomist or a soil scientist. My reading is that the on-farm gains these days are more in growing practice changes, right? The way you maintain the soil and soil stability, what you choose to grow, et cetera. And then a lot of the water gains are more kind of on a step back sort of, regional management scale and, cities pulling water away from farmers because cities will pay an order of everywhere that farmers and cities are in competition for water in the world that I know of. Cities will outbid farmers. If it really is marketized and they're allowed to bid for the water, cities will outbid farmers by an order of magnitude in what they're willing to pay for the water. And then within the farmers, the specialty growers, the nut farmers and things like that will outbid the staple crop farmers, by look at the Murray-Darling in Australia. That's exactly what we're seeing going on with this marketized scheme. And it's been so turbulent in the landscape. It's done some good things, but it's also really turbulent in the landscape and really problematic in other ways. I think that sort of overwhelms the ability to do the kind of, on-farm dripping. So where you have the pre-existing conditions, sure, and support for small farmers to move in that direction and agricultural extension, critically important. In a lot of places where you look at the raw numbers and say, we could save a lot of water there, it's these other dynamics that take over. It's a great question.
Ken, this is Clay Robinson in agriculture. I'm a soil scientist, spent most of my life in dry places.
So correct me then.
Well, no, just a comment on, Dave was asking about efficient systems. I just want to put this one out there because I've observed it. Efficiency is not equal to conservation. So you can apply water much more efficiently and still use all the water you have and run. So that's, if you know anything about the High Plains aquifer, especially the parts that dip down into Texas, High Plains, and eastern New Mexico, many of those farmers are applying water extremely efficiently, and they're running out because that was a finite resource.
Absolutely.
So just the thought, yes, we can be efficient. That doesn't mean we're going to conserve water or even ensure that future generations are going to have access to water.
And think about a different sort of scheme where you got sort of canal irrigation and you've got people who are kind of upstream and downstream on the irrigation scheme. And suddenly, for the first couple of farms that are taking water off of the the irrigation canal, just opening a little gate and taking water, you know, on Mondays or something. If you really increase the efficiency, if you don't renegotiate water rights in that irrigation scheme, then, you know, that first farmer, they're still going to take the water they're entitled to, and they're going to double their production and so on and so forth. And it's the folks at the bottom of the scheme that are going to, you know, there's an enormous redistribution within the scheme that's going on at the same time that you're you know, nominally you're enhancing efficiency. So again, you're into this really weedy area of social conflict. Even if there's potential for conservation there, what it might end up being is looks more like redistribution. And so suddenly newfound abundance is a path to conflict rather than so it's the software that's really got to be thought about in those cases.
And you just identified all the issues associated with rivers in the West and Native American water rights.
Is that right? Yeah, yeah. Not my area of intense expertise, but in some other parts of the world where I have done some grounded work, very much the case. Thanks for that observation.
Other questions? We got a couple more minutes yet.
Can I throw out another one, Joan? Do you mind? Okay.
Go ahead, Dave.
You identified a tremendous amount of factors that are going to affect this moving forward, but one that I'm concerned about is social media and misinformation. How has that played a role in let's say, you know, conflicts that may arise from water, but no one's going to understand that completely because there's misinformation and this social media aspect of it?
Yeah, I'll share just observations. I'm certainly not an authority on social media. I mean, I do a fair bit of work on social movements though, and that's one of the places where, you know, my impression of what's going on with social media is that it tends to cause people to double down on pre-existing. It's not all that different than watching MSNBC versus watching Fox News. We tend to think of it as this distributor of information, and there's no question that it has this enormous capacity for that. But it's also more like a grazing space where people go to graze where the thing that they like to eat sort of resides. And so in the same way that, you know, you can probably guess whether I watch Fox News or MSNBC, there's a lot of the dynamics around that I see specifically around water around that. And so, you know, I don't do a lot of tweeting, but if I tweet something out, who retweets it and in what context and how it sort of goes. So there's enormous capacity. You know, if you don't know when the water truck is coming, then somebody's got to stay home to take delivery of the water. I see this in Palestine. And it's going to be a young girl, and she's not going to school, right? And we talk about women hauling water and so on, and that's a big part of it. You know, we don't talk about the fact that a young girl who's having her period doesn't have sanitation at the school, so she stops going to school. Or she's sitting home waiting for the water truck because she doesn't know when the Palestinian Authority is going to send that truck. And the power's got to be on because they got to pump it up because they store it on the roof in a tank and all of that, right? And so there we've seen this really amazing potential around just putting, because you know, people have cell phones, even very it's ubiquitous, right? In every community there's phones. And so just being able to put that sort of information around, really exciting. The other thing that's really exciting is crowdsourcing data. There's some really interesting experience in the Mekong where a lot of this contentious infrastructure is being built. There are projects that are starting to crowdsource information, like I saw a construction crew along this stream this morning, or the fish are here earlier than they were last year, and so on. And so for that sort of, you know, mass dissemination of information and mass, now we have to think hard about what kind of data we're getting with crowdsourcing. It's dirty, but sometimes it's good enough. Enormous potential. But for the political dialogue that you're talking about, that kind of sits in between bombing it all out and drawing it all in, I think that most people are doubling down on commitments that they already hold with those forms of communication, rather than being brought to new and richer kinds of understandings. It's a great research topic.
Well, on that one, I think thank Ken for his time. I put in the chat the link to the more informal discussion that starts at 4:15. We'll give Ken a few minute break here, grab some water, grab another cup of coffee, if you're like me.
If I have any more coffee, you don't want me in an informal meeting. So, but
well,
I'll be there at 4:15 for sure. 5:15 for you. 5:15 for me. 4:15
Yeah.
for you.
This was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed the discussion and the questions. Look forward to more of it. And it's a pleasure to pull my thoughts together and share them with you today. I do hope to visit campus someday.
Well, we hope we can get you here in person next time.
For sure.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.